Are you ready? Okay, so I need to find something
I have seriously been looking at buying a gaming chair for my own, and I play like an hour or two at night sometimes. But
They're built for the future.
But they're super comfortable, and they're because think about your desk chair. Like we just did ergonomic assessments in our office, and like half the people got new chairs because the chairs that most people buy are you go to Staples and there's a chair for $50 and it's done versus the $300-400 chairs, which is what's really neat.
But even the $300-400 chairs. No, we're getting ours cost
Sorry, I just meant like I was just kind of saying the comparison between like one Staples one versus like a Herman Miller chair or like. But it's interesting because I know of office places that are actually buying gaming chairs because they are $600 and they're more comfortable.
All right, thank you. The first thing I have to tell you, do not push the doors on the side. They will break apparently. So if you have to go to the washroom, use the door at the back. All right. So thank you all for coming. I'm Lucie Lalinière. I'm the Executive Director of Interactive Ontario. So we're all here today in this room and live on live streaming. Thank you, Vincent, for launching the Discoverability Report. So why did we do this? This journey started about a year ago when the industry told us, hey, we all know that discoverability is a challenge. We need to be able to share more tips and insights among each other. And that was the genesis of this project. And the project has been led by Laura, who's going to moderate the panel. And 27 companies and stakeholders contributed their insights to this piece of research. So the result is a very tangible report that's going to help the industry, and it's also a starting point. I was talking to some of you. More to be done, but it's a solid foundation for the future. So this wouldn't have been possible if Ontario Creates hadn't decided to support this piece of research, and also our partners, the CMPA, RBC, and Ubisoft. So a big thank you to our sponsors for the study. Also, we wouldn't be here today if not for our presenting partner, Ontario Creates, and our partners, the Bell Fund, Global Affairs, Canada, as well as RBC, and CMF. Richard, are you in the room? Okay, so CMF was also a presenting partner. So in the end, though, as I said, this is the result of a collective effort, so we need to thank you all. Many of you are here in the room, live on internet, and will be on the panel. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Raina to address the group and intro Laura. Thank you, Raina.
Thanks very much, Lucie. I'm Raina Wells. I'm Director of Business Affairs and Research at Ontario Creates, and I think many of you know us. For those who don't, Ontario Creates is an agency of the Government of Ontario, and our mandate is economic development of the creative media industries, which, as well as IDM, include film and TV, books, I have to count, film and TV, books, magazines, and music, as well as IDM. Our situation gives us a bird's eye view across all the industries. And from that view, we can see the challenges that are common across the industries, and discoverability is one of those. For that reason, we were very pleased to be a funding partner for this report, which, as Lucie said, provides concrete tactics and shares best practices coming directly from the industry that we hope will support your success. The project could not have succeeded without collaboration. Thank you to my fellow funding partners for their contribution. CMPA, Ubisoft, and RBC. And thank you also to Lucy and Interactive Ontario for leading the project. Lucy, it's always a pleasure to work with you guys. And to Laura and Gayle for carrying out the work. Thank you especially to everyone who agreed to be interviewed for the study. There were too many of you to acknowledge you all by name now. Please have a look at the appendix. At the end of the report, there's a full list. I know a number of you are here today. You were very generous with your time and generous in sharing your ideas and the tactics that have worked for you. I've seen that kind of openness and generosity in this industry before, but I am always impressed by it. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Laura Ming, moderator of today's discussion. Laura founded her company, Archetype and Effects, to provide organizations in the storytelling industries with strategic marketing and business development support. She's provided that support for more than a decade, developing and executing award-winning marketing campaigns. She's co-branded promotions and new consumer offerings. She's driven results for companies in the film, TV, immersive, and interactive media industries. She's been a presenter at many international industry events, including Augmented World Expo, Series Mania, and South by Southwest. She's also a contributing author and media commentator, and is a board member for several organizations, including, and this is my favorite, you might get this, maybe have heard this before. She's a board member of the board of the Toronto Ring of the International Brotherhood of Magicians. So please join me in welcoming Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have no magic tricks, unfortunately, to perform today, so sorry. I'd love to invite actually the first panel up to join me. Excellent. So, as everyone comes up, just to set the stage for how we're going to do this today, there'll be 3 panels. The panels are themed around key sections in the discoverability report. And we wanted to start with talking about insights. So this panel is focused on insights related to discoverability here. And we have some fantastic people joining us. I'm so appreciative of your time and actually all of the panelists' time here today. Why don't we start with some quick intros? Yannick? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. So I'm Yannick Spagna. I'm a brand director at Ubisoft Toronto. Worked on many games. Been at Ubi for 18 years, doing many different types of jobs, from operational marketing to business development, editorial, and finally branding within the studio.
Hey, my name is Chris Yee, and I started a studio called Yukon Games about 10 years ago with a co-founder of mine. We focused on building games for Facebook and then eventually mobile. And so we've honed in on mobile, where our current titles are Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and Jeopardy World Tour. They're big titles that we're pretty proud of at the studio, and we're about 90 people in Toronto building a lot of other original IP as well.
And I'm Alex Rushdie, CEO and Creative Director at 13 AM Games. We're a studio that was founded by a bunch of college grads just over 5 years ago. And we work in the console space, so Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, Xbox, all that kind of stuff. We are working on our 3rd major title right now, and we're about 12 people.
Excellent. So it's a good range in terms of large and small. Now let's talk about insights. So I want to focus first on insights that help discoverability, but insights that you capture at the very beginning stages of the product lifestyle. And this is going to be a great conversation, and I also want to let the audience know, feel free to, if you have a burning question, raise your hand, and we can chat with you. And there's also going to be 5 minutes at the very end of the panels to answer questions as well. But why don't we start with Ubisoft? We go into detail in the report in terms of what you do at the very beginning stages. Can you share?
Yeah. Actually, you're absolutely right. Discoverability starts right at the beginning of the process, when the game is not barely an ID, when it's a concept. It's pretty important. It's one of the core aspects of my job is working within the team with creative directors, producers, designers, try to really gauge what they try to build and feed them with many different insights coming from many different sources, whether it's studies, whether it's our welcoming, players in our office for them to get exposed to those ideas. There are many ways, and it's important because it's gonna help the team to focus and streamline their creative vision so that as a brand director, I could translate it later on a clear message, positioning, promise. That's going to be very helpful for the third aspect of marketing, which is operational marketing, for them to have a good brand toolkit to work on their 360 marketing campaigns.
Right, and what does the process look like for that?
At the beginning, the process is very organic. There is no magic tricks, so there are multiple ways. The first one is that there are some studies existing, so it's a good start. There is the internet as well, which is also a good start. At UB we have a department called Consumer and Market Knowledge that are dedicated to that. They are working on delivering the different teams of Ubisoft with market trends, player segmentations, but also more specific studies on the game we have already released and our players, because we have a big database of players. So we start from that, and then this is really a good fuel, good food to start conversation when some people are thinking about ideas, thinking about pitches. Because you could have a great idea, but that has never been done, just not because of technical reason, but just because it doesn't appeal to anybody. So the idea is really to try to extract what our creative people wants to do, understand it, and then see if there is an opportunity, if there is challenges as well. And once we have identified that, start to gauge and prioritize what could be the audience. Why would they be interested? What would be the differentiators that would make our proposal standing out? And how would we communicate it? And with what channel, etc., etc. So it's a very long process, and it starts right at the beginning and normally never ends.
Fantastic. And I just want to, sorry, I'm not going to skip, but I'm just going to, just for contrast. So you have, in contrast to Ubisoft, a smaller studio, still small but mighty. How do you look at insights to help with discoverability?
Yeah, so for us, when it comes to the games that we want to make, because we're small, we're still afforded the kind of idealistic opportunity to be like, okay, is everyone on the team actually excited about this idea? Is this something that we genuinely want to make first? Because when you're an indie team, your passion is going to be what drives a lot of why people want to play it. People don't really buy the product; they buy why are you doing it? Why, what does this mean? And then beyond that, the next stage we kind of test it against. Okay, well, is there a market for this? And where is the market for this? Where are these people meeting? Where do they talk? What are they looking for? And the other thing is, because we're small, we tend not to do the short announcement to release window. We find that with a smaller company, that's just not going to work. For a bigger company with marketing budgets that are, could fund 6 of our games, sure. For us, it's a matter of finding that audience early and getting them pretty much involved in the development. So, creating a Discord where they can look at early builds, play it, give feedback on character designs, feel like they own part of it. It's kind of adopting the Kickstarter model without doing Kickstarter, That's huge for us. The other thing as well, in terms of how we kind of gauge the discoverability of a product is, can anyone or someone at the team, are they part of that community that we're trying to reach out to? Mm-hmm. We find that's incredibly valuable, because if none of us are part of the community we're trying to reach out to, it's going to be just more of a challenge for us in general.
Fantastic, that's helpful. So Chris, you were humble, you didn't mention this in your intro, but your just 2 games combined have between 2 and 2.5 million unique monthly viewers or players. You've done something right. And your team is absolutely incredible when it comes to discoverability for so many reasons, as are all teams. But tell me a little bit more about how you use insights once a product is close to launch to make sure you're doing the right thing when it comes to creative and those fine-tuning elements for the games.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first off, to kind of both the commentary, we start pretty early as well. I think, the times when we haven't started early enough, we go back and reflect on that we wish we had started a lot earlier. So we've definitely learned from a lot of failures in those cases. I think once you've had the market validation and you've got sort of the internal validation amongst the team where there's a lot of excitement and energy for a project and you've sort of moved along through the development phase, and it's never a straight line. It's always kind of ups and downs because you might start with a premise and you think it's a great idea, but it goes through a lot of different transformations and is incompatible with other ideas you might have or other assumptions you've made. Along the way, we really try to scope out time for user feedback. So we'll maintain beta groups, either amongst which we'll pull from our existing titles, or we'll go on a QA kind of test outsource kind of website and pull together a group and try to understand some very specific assumptions that we've had, whether or not they've actually played through and build our user cases that way. We do try to engage people on Discords and Reddits and things like that, as well as email groups. It's definitely an effort to constantly keep up with that because the balance is timing. The market in where we compete in mobile is moving like bonkers, right? There's a new great game coming out every day, every week. There are a couple of those types of titles, so it's moving really, really fast. But you just have to remind yourself that there's significant, there's a significant payoff to just really taking the time to understand your users and engaging with them, and making them feel like they're part of the process, making them feel like they're important and understood.
Right. So a question for all three of you. What you mentioned, like beta groups and going online to check to see how people are reacting to characters, to game concepts. What's the right amount of people to test concepts with?
Well, it depends what you are looking for. As you mentioned, guys, I think, you're right. When you start to want to refine, it's great to have a significant number. So you talked about the Discord, and you talked about even sometimes, whether it's closed or open, exposing the game to people so that they can play and they can react, and you would have tag in your game so you would understand their behavior. So then you can after ask them why they did that or not did that. So it's one way. But at the very beginning, for example, if I'm talking about Starling Battle for Atlas, which is a game I worked on, we did, let's say, roughly after a year of development, we needed to do an exploratory to understand if the thing we were putting in the game would resonate. So we did an exploratory here in Toronto, 60 families and their children who would go there in their apartment and in their house. I would not say who I am. I would just be the guy taking notes. We'd have a moderator, and we would expose them to characters, starships, gameplay features, videos, and we would get pretty honest and free conversation about what they think, whether it's about aesthetics, whether it's about, that character, I can see him doing this or that. About the features, it would really help us to as you said, gauge if we were close to what we were thinking or not at all. Because sometimes you think that your main key feature is that, but kids, they don't care, and then you have some realization moment at that point. So exploratory 60 was 60, but we are also sometimes doing much more smaller groups, but on with more time. Like 12 or 16, really depends. If you want qualitative feedback, smaller groups. If you want just kind of, I would not say a rating or something like that, but you want a yes or no, the better.
That makes sense.
From our experience, kind of resonate a lot with that. It really depends what you're trying to test. I think in a more mature stage of a game, if you're trying to test something that relates to retention features or engagement features, that's, you can do that relatively easily. We do a lot of A/B testing in our games, so we tend to test all of our features, and the basis of that is mostly just to learn. We want to know why certain features engage well, and we want to know also what doesn't engage really well to drive our thinking and to kind of build that collective library of knowledge that we've got. And so, retention features, you don't need as many users. I think if it's monetization related, if you think about the dynamics of a mobile game, much fewer users monetize. Maybe it's 3 or 4% of your users. So you need a broader group. You need to let the test run longer. And we always test for statistical significance when we run these tests. It's a very technical exercise when you're running live ops on a game and it's already out there. Earlier, it's definitely kind of, it's much more of an organic feel, and I think what you're trying to drive is you're really trying to inspire your team and equip them with as much feedback as possible, but it's also very easy to get drowned in the feedback. Early in the game cycle, the game vision is very fragile, and it could, you could easily go off on the wrong foot. So I think it's very important to define the criteria of what you're looking for, and the more you've had the opportunity to think it through, the more you're able to get out of the process.
Right, and you mentioned user retention, or that's one of your big KPIs. What are some other KPIs that your team monitors on a regular basis?
Yeah, I mean, we look at all sorts of different metrics. So retention of users there's kind of like broad-based, high-level metrics that describe the quality of the title that the entire industry references. But if you start to dive deeper, we track things that relate to the economy, whether or not your people are sinking as much currency as you require them to, and if there are sources of currency that are there's too much of or too little of, how those dynamics work. So that's kind of economy balancing type stuff. We look at engagement around specific features. So what's the pool of players that can engage or get to the point where they've unlocked these features? So it's kind of like funnel analysis, but feature specific, and through the whole process, we look at engagement around certain flows that we would want to drive. So social engagements, how often are people engaging with other people, and is that happening to a degree that we've designed it to? And we're pretty detailed internally, at least, about writing introspectives for all of the features that we do. So after we launch an A/B test, we'll write a report to see what we've learned. And a lot of the times it's ambiguous. It's really tough to tell. Maybe you don't have enough data. There's something that you're missing. But we try to be diligent about the effort, because when it does pay off, it works really well. And a good example of that is, like, sometimes we'll have to go through 3 versions of a feature to get it right, and that's painful. Like, every version takes a month or 2, but by the time you hit the right version, you've got an insight that can drive the game, that you can sort of ride through the live ops of the game for the next 6 months to a year, and it could become a pretty cornerstone thing as in part of the game.
Fantastic. And then Alex, for you and for your team, what are you tracking? What's important to you when you're tracking the impact of your discoverability once a product's launched?
Once a product's launched, because our products are not necessarily live ops products. They're kind of, pay once and you're good to go. So, I mean, sales in general are always good, but also specific things like we'll track the hashtags on social media platforms, and like how much conversation is there actually about this game. And we do that pre and post launch. How many views on YouTube comments, like all those kind of, that's all key data pre and post launch. Even like how much fan art is there of what we're making. It lets us know how we're resonating. And these are all stuff that like anyone can access. Another interesting thing is, of course, analytics. We haven't yet installed like proper analytics software into our games. What we do is we actually build, because we're release on consoles and PC, we actually build our achievements to give us analytics. So, it's simple stuff is like an achievement for how many people beat level 1, 2, 3, 4 in final can easily tell you, well, how many people are actually getting to the end of your game. If it's only 4% and you sold 25,000 copies on that platform, then that's something to keep in mind for an update or new content that you bring into the game. Yeah, and then like in terms of when we're actually testing to try to find data pre-launch, for us, we find that there isn't really a number that, like, it's not about the quantity of people that we reach as much as it is about the quality. Like we can, for example, we're making a game that's like a hardcore action game featuring giant monsters like Godzilla. So we didn't have the ability to just like do a market research study here in Toronto. So what we did is we went to a convention of Godzilla fans. It was like 4,000 people. And we went there and we showed the game, we showed a trailer, we sold merchandise. We just threw everything at the wall and saw what sticked. And what did they latch onto? And gave everyone a survey with a bunch of questions. But on the flip side of that, which is good. Like if you're indie and you're trying to save money and you can find a market that has a convention, just go to it and just talk to everyone there. If you don't have that, then you can also find like one key influencer. So for us, it's finding those people on YouTube that are only playing like hardcore action games, and you just invite one of them to the office, get them to play for a day and give their feedback, and you're going to get just as valuable insight,
That's great, and a lot cheaper.
A lot cheaper, yeah.
We'll chat about that Godzilla convention after. That sounds fantastic. So we only have a few minutes left before questions. But if we're to wrap up and say, like, what are your must-haves when it comes to insights? Like, what do you absolutely need to know before launching a game and need to track in order to be successful, not just for product sales, but for discoverability and also ensuring that you're constantly growing your base of users? So discoverability, for example, in finding new markets.
I think for us, it's how big is your potential user base? Like, how big is this market? And then also, how underserved are they? Because there are massive red ocean markets out there where there's a huge pool of people, but if they're already being served by a lot of other services, games, etc., then it's probably not worth it. But if you can find a decently sized market that is very underserved and is clamoring for something, then it's perfect.
Very nice. Chris, what about for you?
I think that's really understanding your user and your market is super important. It can oftentimes be misleading. So, finding the right signals that lead to those insights takes, I think, a lot of experience and time, and just being able to read kind of things that you've seen in the past and how they've played out, and keeping close communication with those users, kind of really fostering those communities is super important. However you decide to do that, whether it's through surveys, through email lists, through groups that you regularly engage with in Facebook groups or stuff like that, I think keeping that line of communication open is super important, because they also play other games. They don't just play your game, so you get a good deal of insight from that.
Excellent. The closer. No pressure.
Super nice answers already. I would say, really, it's really being able to define who are we doing the games for, really, the audience, because it's so easy to say, oh, it's for everybody, it's from 7 to 77, that type of things. But well, we are working within timing and budget constraints, and we need to understand who are we doing the game for, what they are going to be appealed to, how they are going to speak about it, and when you need to engage money on an audience, you better know it, and this audience is evolving fast as well. So it's not about saying we are only going to talk to those guys, but it's more about being able to set up priorities and start somewhere and see if it can expand through time, so that you can make the right investment at the right time through the right funnels.
Excellent. It's not just about who, it's why. Where are they?
Exactly, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to open it up for questions. Sorry, we can applaud. I saw people starting. Does anyone have any questions for panel number one? Go ahead.
How do you balance between, say, creative vision and then sort of data-driven or market-driven requirements or things that are, you're getting data from your users, but at the same time you still have a creative vision and you want to be authentic?
Oh, yes. So how do you balance, if I'm doing this correctly, how do you balance your creative vision, your team's passion, for example, for a concept, along with insights that you're getting from the marketplace?
Yeah, this is a really good question, really insightful. Thanks. I think internally for us, we require that if we're going to start a project, there needs to be a creative vision holder, and that person's pain threshold needs to be very high. In that, after you have that and identify that person, everybody else's job is really to kind of ask a lot of questions and challenge a lot of assumptions. That's sort of how we've looked to balance it. I think if you can move through that phase, you've gotten to a point where you've given yourself a chance at success, and the people that we try to surround that person with are people that are pretty knowledgeable about the market. They have differing perspectives and other opinions, and I think the more discussive we get at that phase, the better the ideas. It really just strengthens things. So it's not an easy process. It's not like it's super prescriptive. We try to keep it organic, but you need that vision holder, and then you need the people that challenge that vision holder.
And I just to comment on that, I think for a studio of our size, as a general rule of thumb for us, if we have an issue where there's what the team wants creatively and what the data says, we'll 9 times out of 10 go with what the team wants. Because for us, carrying that passion through to the product, especially in the indie sphere, is way more valuable than creating something that seems a little more built by committee. And people can really taste that when they play the product.
I can add one more thing. Well, I think also it's an iterative process. It's not frozen in time. So there is an idea, there is a passion, there is creativity, and it's a dance. You are getting the data, and data is just an information. It's not good or bad. You are playing with it. You are tweaking the thing. But you're right. If at some point you feel that this is not the game, this is not why you are here, and this is not you are here, but then you decide either to pursue or just to stop it. But it's really, to me, it's a really combined effort through the course of the development to refine, and sometimes it's just a question of the idea is there, it works, but sometimes it's just the way of expressing it. So maybe sometimes it's just it can be a communication problem outside. So it's just about just changing the key messaging, and maybe suddenly the recipe works. So there is a lot of iterative process.
Excellent. And then Deb? Yeah.
Is there a formula that you use or an approximation to how much you allocate your budget towards your audience research and your marketing, et cetera? I love that you start early. That's amazing. But is there a formula, a percentage?
When I was in school, I was told that there is a formula, and it's 50%. I have never done that in my life. I think we all probably would say we don't have any formula for it. And especially for us, it's finding just the most efficient way possible to reach that. If we could do it without spending a dime, we would do it. But I think that in terms of trying to find a general balance to it, I don't think there's going to be a formula for it, but by looking at your KPIs, you'll be able to judge, are you doing enough or are you doing too little? You look at the litmus test through development. Okay, have we done enough? Have we not done enough? And you'll kind of know and suss it out. And it'll be game by game for sure, product by product.
And frankly, I like what you said about the Godzilla stuff, because sometimes it's just it's a guerrilla. You are doing you are using whatever you can to get this data. So yeah, sometimes you are lucky, and there is a study out there, and you have the money to pay for it, and it answers a lot of your questions. But sometimes not at all. When we started on Starlink, we were not at all from the toy industry. We knew how to do video games, but we were not okay. Some of us had kids and had IDs. But well, we went to kids convention. We went to all of this stuff, doing the polls and the surveys, and what's important is always keeping it and doing something of it. What you don't want is investing all this time for this handing up somewhere on your desktop. looking the evolutions of what you are doing is interesting also. I feel there are stuff that are cheap, I believe, some that are less cheap. And this is the combination of all of that that helps you to find your own balance and not the 50%, because I agree, same for me. Business school, 50%, no.
Excellent. So I wish we can talk a lot longer. This was incredibly insightful. See what I did there? Haha. I thank you so much for your time. We're going to go to the next panel. So thank you guys again. So Alex and Evan, come on down. So again, just going back to the report, this is, pick your seat. Sounds good. Grab a mic. So in the report, again, this is about discoverability. As you'll see, we get to marketing and communications tactics at the very end. That's panel number 3. There's so much that goes into discoverability, from insights all the way through to developing the right relationships to help with discoverability. So that's the topic of this next panel. So why don't we start with introductions? If you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Evan Jones. I'm owner of Stitch Media. We are a 15-person team here in Toronto. We're right now working on a pretty big VR title, I hope, with Oculus, and we are getting ready to launch a console game on Nintendo Switch. So those are some partnerships I'll be talking about, and we have basically built Stitch Media on the idea of stitching together different teams and building partnerships.
Excellent.
And I'm Alex Jansen with Pop Sandbox. We're, I guess, 10 years of business, but we've done graphic novels, film, video games, interactive experiences. So I guess the stuff we'll probably talk most about is, well, our first game was a game called Pipe Trouble that was mobile only. Our next game was Loud on Planet X, which was cross-platform. It was like an indie music game where you're defending your stage from aliens with music, with bands like Metric, Mets, Tegan and Sarah, Fucked Up, quite a cross-section. And then most recently, we're doing On Foot, which is a self-guided walking tour app with AR, augmented reality, virtual reality components within it.
You guys just listed 5 or 6 different hardware platforms that you've developed for, which is why I wanted you on this panel, because all of those hardware platforms then come with different stores, in many cases, where consumers are then going to discover your product, or they're going because they've already discovered your products and they want to buy. Can you tell me more with what you can share? I know Oculus is coming, but tell me more about the type of relationships that you've developed. Let's start with hardware partners and store platforms. Like, how did those come about? There's few people that lead discussions on the biz dev side, for example, with the hardware platforms and stores, but you've been able to navigate a way to develop relationships with them. How did that happen?
So there are tons of different storefronts. That's a big challenge, but they also see that as a challenge because your attention is getting split between all these different locations. The iOS store, app store is competing with the Oculus store, for example. And so they also want something out of this relationship, which is they want to have stronger offerings. They want to constantly be, and so you come at the conversation knowing that this is not just, you're not coming as a beggar to the whole thing and saying like, please, I just want to make my game. You're also trying to make a case to say, this is going to help you. This is going to step you up as well. And so, you have to go into that with a mindset that even though they're, at the top of a very big, cash mountain, and I am not, you still have to come into it thinking that you are bringing something to the table that they might want. And so that started the whole thing. As a question of how did we get to that point, it took a ton of time, and it took a lot of brand building, not just in an individual game title, but in having a studio that didn't disappear after a one game, and then also building long-term relationships that were built on enough trust that they could broker an introduction. And so it was about getting, one relationship that then said, oh, you've got to meet this person because, we trust each other. And then from that, you piggyback up to the next one, and it just took a lot of time. And being in the right place at the right time is great, but it was all the homework that got to that.
Right. In essence, you have a discoverability campaign to get to the right people to then give you support for your actual games.
Yeah, discoverability has a last mile that I'm sure we'll talk about, but it also has all the other miles to get there. And so like getting someone to say yes in that moment is different than laying down the groundwork for it.
Right. And once they say yes, there's yes in, for example, investment in a game, but how do you get them to say yes to supporting discoverability? Alex, I'll ask you, like in terms of on their store platforms.
Yeah, well, in our case, so the first game we did was iOS only. The second game ended up, as mentioned, like started as a mobile game. It was only going to be 4 bands, mobile only. And then as we picked up traction and we got bigger bands, we had, and more bands, more audience interest, then we ended up deciding to expand to PS4, Steam, iOS, and Android. In hindsight, I'd actually say we overexpanded, and the market showed it. We did very well on iOS. We did quite well on PS4. Steam was a bit of a bomb for us. I think that for a small team, we probably spread ourselves a little too thin. But how those opportunities came about, so most of what we'd done had been documentary based, so we didn't really have necessarily the credibility. So what really helped for us is listening to the feedback where we're hitting walls, even just when we're piecing together the financing. So we had a certain amount of credibility and critical acclaim within one arena, but so when we're looking at moving into the music genre, we reached out and Jess Mack came on board as which was a very strategic play for us, because able to bring in as an exec producer and as a consultant, but then had done sound shapes with Beck and Deadmau5 and Jim Guthrie, which all of a sudden gave us a lot more credibility, also gave us the experience we need, and it led us to bringing on a developer who'd worked on sound shapes, who had that background with that genre. But that also translated to getting us our meeting with Sony. So, and then I think a lot of it was really important to be out in the market, and I think that's where, for us, formerly the Export Fund, but the Global Market Development Fund was key, because that got us to places like Indiecade East and PAX East, where we were able to actually meet with these people. And that was so much easier, especially being Toronto-based. So like when we were down in South by Southwest, we were able to meet the Steam rep, which would have been near impossible otherwise. We ended up doing a big Kickstarter campaign, and that hinged on being in New York and being able to meet the person in charge of video game campaigns for Kickstarter. So a lot of it was like getting down there, getting in front of everyone.
Excellent. And then once you're down there, how do you negotiate to get support? So consumer-facing support. Your answer, it's not easy.
Consumer-facing support.
Yep.
Do you mean marketing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And so that's the problem that I have right now. And then the problem that I have right now is that there are a lot of other people doing amazing creative things, and you have to be, chosen. Like they've even when you're having a partnership, I don't mean to just speak only about the one that's going on right now. It's top of mind, but even though there are other, like they've invested in us, and so you think automatically that means like, well, now we're the belle of the ball, we're going to show up. No, there's a lot of other investments that are happening, and so we are also now in a race to like be the most impressive at that point. So even once you have the relationships, it's not guaranteed that, because the relationship goes both ways, and if you haven't done your side of it, then they're not going to sort of rise to that occasion. So it's not always guaranteed in the relationships, I guess to say. It's something that requires you to constantly be working on the relationship. You have to keep updating people, because they're not just going to see the final product and go, wow, this is great, let's backfill 6 months of marketing strategy to get to where we want to be. You actually have to be like in that pipeline, so that when they're thinking like Q4 2020, they're already got your product in their mind, and you're staying in their conversation.
And then when it comes to constant communication, they obviously get a lot. Are there any things that you would suggest people avoid when it comes to those updates? or just developing those relationships?
Well, yeah, I would just say that for us, it was really important that we maintained the communication at each stage because with your rep, things will also change. So in our case, we built a relationship with our rep at Apple, which was really important. But then as we got closer with Loud, we started to make sure that we're lining up with their priorities. So in this case, at that point, they were moving from iTunes to Apple Music. That was something that they really wanted to be doing. That their push is going to be going for it. So if you're able to integrate that, so that for us, we did a switch to make like streaming playlists within the game that helped for it. The other stuff that helped for us was having constant communication around timing for launch. So we were making sure with Sony that we're hitting in a good spot where it gives us the best. Because no one will ever tell you whether you're going to get featured. Certainly on the Apple side, but there's things that you can do to put yourself, give a better position for it. And that was the same thing even with us with Kickstarter, as we timed it with talks with Luke at the time about when best to do it. And then we also, even in it when we announced, we strategically held back announcing any of the bands so that we were able to do an exclusive where Rolling Stone announced all the bands for the music scene, Polygon announced it for all for the gaming scene, and then from there it gave us the best chance to try to get our biggest push, given the fact that we didn't have a big budget.
Those are awesome examples of collaborations and partnerships. To have those exclusivities. Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I mean, you were asking the question. I was thinking, do I ever not tell things to the partners? And I mean, there's always day-to-day things, but there are some partnerships where you do talk about how you're not hitting your timelines, right? And you can see that far enough out that it's really bad to hide that if you can see it coming. And so hopefully the partnerships are strategic enough and they are sound enough that they also are willing to move on that. I mean, we've had other relationships where it's really just like, it's got to be on this date, and it doesn't matter what it is, and then you're in a different situation altogether where you're cutting big chunks out of it or something because the relationship isn't an ongoing discussion. So, I mean, I have had relationships where you're like, I wish I could tell them this, but I know they're gonna freak out or they're not going to react in the right way. But hopefully all the relationships you can do that.
Right. That's a great point. And there's other types of relationships. So like there's artists, for example, that are part of the exactly what you just mentioned. Can you tell me more about how they promoted the game? You elaborated a little bit, and it's in the report as well. But
yeah,
the audience here,
well, absolutely. And I feel like I'm plugging Ontario Creates a lot today. But the way we worked with lining up the bands was actually it was a Music Makes It, I think it was the event, but it was about interactive digital media companies and film companies meeting up with labels, and that for us was a huge part because then what we did is we had a whole series of meetings with label reps, found out who they're most excited in pushing, and then that really helped, and also timing-wise who they're going to be getting behind. And the other thing we looked at is looking at artists who are really crossover or really into gaming. Like you couldn't find a bigger music fan or a gaming fan than Lights. There's a avid gamer, or like Mets have done score on Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead Redemption 2. We had Cadence Weapon, who's also like another avid gamer, and so we were looking for bands who are also bands and labels that are going to help us push. And so that was really important for us, is kind of curating the list, working with bands that want to be promoting, because again, we didn't have a built-in audience of our own, so we were looking and leaning on to that. So we were expecting, and it was a huge thing, like Tegan and Sarah during the middle of our Kickstarter campaign, we did signed prints with them in the game style, and their tweet just, you could immediately see the crossover. And then what eventually allowed us to do is we would track how many fans for each of the bands, and then we eventually switched our whole strategy because we got to the point that there was 5 million fans across the bands, so we moved from essentially trying to capture a wider demographic into really just making a game for the super fans. And that was based more on like talks with investors, but the idea that if you can convert 1% to 3% of your super fans, which is a pretty good metric, well then we're in a spot where with a small enough team, a small enough budget, that makes total financial sense. So then it ended up becoming less about trying to expand and capture a really wide audience and more about making the best game for them, and even tailoring our social media campaign to their fan base.
That's so interesting. And
I have a question for Alex. Who was the first band? How did they come on?
Yeah, so the first band, I also swearing again, but Fucked Up, and they're a great band who are really involved in the art scene in Toronto, and so they scored. Well, they were fans of we did a graphic novel called Kank. We had like mutual admiration through that. They ended up scoring. Mike and Jonah scored on Pipe Trouble, and then it organically grew from there. They were the first band on board for Loud, but then Mike had produced some early Austra, and then that led to July Talk, and then actually another huge push for us was Brendan Canning, who's just one of the nicest guys you could get, who did some original score for us from Broken Social Scene. But then he did an introduction to Metric, and then it's kind of a snowball as it went through. It's like it started to validate.
I'm going to put you on the spot now. When it comes to relationships like with publishers, are you open to talking about any upcoming relationships or distributors and how you're working with them?
I mean, it's pitching season coming up.
Okay.
What we're preparing is the pitches. So we don't currently have a publisher attached to the project or the other project, but we want very much to have a publisher involved. So
Live stream.
you're out there. The tricky part is like where the publisher gets involved because there's so many different publishers, and the trend that has been mind-blowing to me lately is that there are some hit video game creators who have immediately become publishers, and that they've said, I have enough of fan credibility that the next game that I anoint will be successful because of my reputation. And so there's a certain moment where it's like, once you get your hit game, you should stop making games. You should just start looking for other games to endorse in a strange sort of relationship there. And so the publishers that we are talking with know that they have a trusted brand, and the question is just trying to earn that trust and say that this is something. And what we've found is that because there is so much trust involved, if you don't have any prior relationship, what you have to have is the game ready to go. Like you're basically almost ready to ship at the point at which a publisher is like, you're right, this is a great game, because showing them a pitch deck, they've already got 100 other meetings where they're seeing fully realized games, and you're asking them to take such a huge level of risk. Now, I would love if the market demand were shifting and there was more, there was an ability for publishers to say, I'm willing to take on a little more risk to get in front of my competitor, right? To say, I'll take it at the beta stage instead of the final stage, but it's just not there right now. What there is because we are pretty fresh to the independent video game scene, even though we've been around for 12 years doing other things, we find that the time that we can reach out to publishers is when we are, a month away from launch, but we're ready to just go on the timeline that they brought to us because they have other things in their pipeline and we might have to delay for 6 months. We are now open to that, but we haven't got that relationship yet.
Okay,
But that's the way it would look.
You're obviously not just pitching any publisher. You're pitching ones that you want to go after based on fit and based on their audience. Like, what are you looking for, especially when it relates to discoverability?
I have messed up before and done the sort of like scattershot approach to be like, if you have the word publisher in your bio, like I am pitching to you. And that really, you can tell it's not going to work even as you're saying it, because the first thing they want you to know is like, what is that brand that they're trying to create with their fan base? Are they a strategy game brand? And so it's research there, but it's like you're checking out what they do. The tricky thing is actually finding that, because some publishers, they'll have 4 different games, and you look at them and you say, what connects the dots between these 4 titles? Because they do not look the same at all to me. It's not like there's a consistency, and you have to ask them internally, like, what is it that you're looking for? That's not usually a conversation you get before you get that first meeting. So it's a mix. Sometimes you're going in kind of cold, and sometimes I always feel more confident when I'm like, I've chosen you as a publisher because you're my number one. And why are you my number one? That's the ideal. It's just very rare.
Makes sense. And Alex, what about you?
Yeah, well, I guess I think almost backwards of it. So I started in film, so it'd be about 20 years ago, and at that point, first project that I produced, it never found its audience. We sold a distribution deal, we thought we'd made it, and it just disappeared. So I flipped and I worked on the distribution side. So I worked with Mongrel Media and I led the home entertainment side for a period of time. And so now I look at it backwards more through the lens of like, what's a realistic expectation from a distributor or from, in the case of gaming, it's like a publisher. You also know that Mongrel is an incredible company, but the number of films that they have at any given time, there's only so much attention that any distributor or publisher is going to be able to give your one project. So what we try to do is strategic and also make sure that we carve out and we have realistic expectations about what we can do, but then we also supplement it as much as we can. So what we did in the case of like having a background in a lot of the marketing and publicity, I recognize I can act out those things, but what I lack is the relationships. So we'd be more likely to engage people to do key relationship buildings. And that's how we were able to get, we ended up bringing on both a music publicist and then a gaming publicist. And the gaming publicist is what set us up with Polygon. The music publicist is what set us up with Rolling Stone. So we were able to kind of strategically work both angles. And then it would really be more than anything a handful of key intros that then we could deliver on. And so I think we try to take the pressure off and also just not conflict with it by just kind of teaming up, I guess.
Would you both have companies that have very strong relationships with publishers, with store platforms, with artists? Sorry, no, publisher, hardware.
Get there.
You know what I mean? Soon. Tell me, do you think, it's hard to prove this, but do you think that you've had to spend less on marketing and PR because of these relationships?
So marketing isn't something that I wish we had a lot of external marketing, but we don't. And in fact, we are often in a situation where we are not just marketing ourselves, but we're also helping other people do their marketing. So we are not ones to sit back and say, oh, well, you do the marketing piece of it, because some of our best marketing is the most embedded marketing, and it's really, really difficult to outsource marketing if you're going to succeed at marketing, because the creative is coming from the project, the insights. You just heard a whole panel about the insights that you're gaining. Those are directly influencing the production, but also the marketing strategy. And so there might be a financial injection that's coming in, or even consulting that comes in, or somebody says, let me come and ask you questions and direct where you're going so that it's all on the right side. But I think I feel pretty strongly that the best marketing comes from the team that's building it.
And when it comes to spending, do you spend, like you're getting additional exposure from like your hardware platforms and the store platforms that you're connected with? Are you spending as much as you would without those relationships?
Well, on our side, I mean, we don't have like an exclusive deal. Sony was fantastic about supporting things like our Kickstarter campaign with download codes for all the giveaways, and we were able to get, I think, 4 features with Apple on Loud. So there's that type of support, but you can't bank on really any of it. So we're really kind of doing our own as much as we are. It's a nice added plus what you can get, and I think a lot of the time the additional support you get isn't something planned. It's almost in response to what you put in motion. So like we ended up getting Kickstarter featured us immediately, but that was because we'd already lined up the publicity. So it's kind of like a lot of the time we have to create the momentum, and then based on creating the momentum, and you can get the traction, then you'll get more platform support. But on our case, we haven't been able to ever bank on it. So we really build our own marketing.
Excellent. And this is, oh, sorry, I got the. I'm going to open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions for this panel? No? Okay. You answered everyone's questions. Yeah. Amazing. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Panel 3, come on down. So this panel is all about yeah. You're back. we have some familiar faces back on this panel. And a not so familiar face, although probably familiar to many in this room because Deb's company works on a lot of different experiences. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Great being here. Good to see a nice crowd. So my company is Innovate by Day. We're a strategic marketing and digital content studio. And my background was as a film and television director many years ago and producer. So I really understood the narrative. And about 10 years ago, we formed the company. And because, I guess, of the relationships that we had in the industry of film and television, we got looped in there. And really what we have excelled at is creating experiences and generating audiences for different content. And we've had the good occasion to work with Alex and other people in the room here on really trying to find those extensions to how to really build that. And I loved what's being said here today about it's all about relationships and understanding your audience.
Definitely. So my first question is for you. So you work on a range, actually, technically, all studios work on a range of products, different platforms like we've heard today, but for your clients, I think it's really important, and you noted this in the report as well, that it's not just about knowing what tactics have worked well in the past. It's different every single time. For every single platform, sometimes even for the same game, like a month later, 2 months later. What's worked for you?
Well, I think it's really having a very, very close relationship with the developer, like the creator, the company. It's understanding the objectives of who the audience is, making sure and asking the questions that they understand who the audience is. And then as it iterates, and God willing, we get in early, right, at that iterative phase and at the testing phase, because if the game is not working, there's a fundamental problem. But if we know that that's working and we understand what the relationship is with the publisher and the platform, then we can really help guide and support that and build out and figure out how to get there, right? Did I answer your question?
Yes, that's great.
Okay.
Very fantastic overview.
But I will say it is really all about the audience and how we're going to get to them.
Definitely.
Right, guys?
And well, actually, Chris, I have a question for you, just in terms of spending. I found it very interesting in doing this discoverability report in terms of the range of budget sizes. But what I found to be relatively consistent was a lot of people had budget to support launch, or maybe like a few weeks leading up to launch. But we talked, when we did the interview, we talked about what UCAN does in terms of ongoing spending, ongoing testing. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, no. I mean, I completely agree with the sort of having to do it really early and making sure there's enough budget early. As we scale out our spend, it's really just a financial exercise for us to, we're strategic about the amounts, but we leave aside a portion that's usually, like 5% or something like a low budget. And I don't think there's any major rules of thumb around these things, but that allow for discoverability of new audiences and new pockets of opportunity. But the large majority of our spend is concentrated around things that are working. So it's to attempt to scale the game, and then it becomes a financial exercise of, if you're talking about a significant portion, significant amounts, what the IRR is, what the kind of the return is, and that's how you have to be diligent about it. Create a system around that.
About pivoting as well, right? I think Alex, you were talking about that a little bit earlier. You've got a plan. You start executing on the plan, and then you start seeing that the audience is actually over here, not over here. So you have to pivot the plan and then build on that, right? And continue that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just to contextualize a little bit, we all of our spend is performance based. So, we've created a system where if we invest, $1,000, we have a good understanding that how we're going to recover that $1,000 and how it's going to generate greater returns. I think that level of discipline is required if you're spending at a really high scale. And these days, all of the channels are very data oriented and starting to move over a lot more to kind of performance based. There's definitely still that brand side of things, but you really need to be a significant scale to afford, I think, brand spend. And then I think at an indie level, I've seen a lot of studios or other people be very, very clever about how to get a lot with a little, just by finding inorganic channels or channels in which people aren't necessarily engaging with, that don't cost a lot of money, but you can create a lot of media hype or interest and engage certain specific communities to expand the interest.
And is it fair to say that it may not take a lot of cash on the table to buy an ad, but it takes a lot of resource and creative thinking
100%.
and time and legwork to actually do that outreach, right?
100%.
I think that's a great point. You have a large marketing team, a large team that works on discoverability. What percent would you say you spend on human resources tied to discoverability versus spending on ads?
Well, I mean, our marketing team actually isn't that big. We've got kind of 4 dedicated growth marketers, where they spend budgets in the millions of dollars. And so, but what really supports them is the systems that we've kind of created around how they go about looking for, what's a strong opportunity and what's a weak opportunity, and how they identify those things. To support that, we've got creative people, artists that are just specifically working on marketing creative. And the world, because it's moved performance based, it's also a lot faster. So the days of sort of like, what you might picture Mad Men to be in, like the whole ad industry, I think that's quite slowly before, but fast right now, shifting towards a very different environment where you're getting feedback right away and you can kind of tell. Relative to the rest of the studio, I mean, I think marketing makes up 10 out of the 90 people that we have, so that's the rough proportion.
Right. That's helpful.
I don't think it's actually enough. I actually think it should be a little bit more than that.
That's good. Well, I mean, you can, especially for like an Ontario studio, is quite large at that number. And some studios, including ones that I interviewed for the report, have about 5 people total. So it's tough. It's tough for them to help people discover their games and the right people to discover their games. I'm throwing this question to you. How do you decide in general, so regardless of how much you're spending, how do you decide where those dollars go when it comes to discoverability?
So, although I work in a creative field, I find that I'm employing the scientific method more and more often in this situation. When you're talking about a fresh project, you're talking about a fresh audience, you're talking about everything is unknown. And yes, you might be able to say, sure, this worked on the last campaign, but all the dependent variables have changed in it. And so now you are fresh again. So you have to you have hunches, but you have to test those assumptions from the beginning. And so I often start very wide and quickly start to expand, like once things are verified, I start to bring it down. And so if I were thinking about ad buying, for instance, I just worked on a project that trying to get a new audience for a new television series. We didn't know anything about who this television audience would be. And so the first question is like, does it skew male, female? And you start with no assumptions. You start with, let's spend equally a small amount and see what that experiment comes back, and then we can start to see insights, and we can start to narrow it down. And once you're at the point that Chris is at, you're starting to do way more refining at that level. But I have to start with fresh eyes every time.
I agree that you can't. We have certain assumptions and certain learnings that we have, but you're right. You can't. Every campaign has to be unique to itself. But I would disagree with you. We don't start as wide. We actually try and get as narrow and as focused as possible when we're launching, and grow out from there. And test, because the more laser focused that we can be in understanding who the audience is that we're trying to reach, we found is the better way to spend and build out. That's just been our experience generally.
And then, so a question for you, Chris. Your team does a lot of like paid performance marketing tactics, but you also put on events. For example, can you elaborate on some maybe lower cost but still high performance tactics that your team does?
Do you mean like events in the games kind of thing?
in-game events.
So, I mean, I think it's par for the course with mobile these days where, live ops is a really big part of what we do. We look at our games not just as products, and we've always been oriented this way in the sense that we've never sold premium games. We've always been free to play. So that started on Facebook and then it moved to mobile. And we never called it live ops before, but it was always that. We're constantly on a stream of releasing new content, making it exciting for players, and now it's got a name. It's live operations, and I think it's just like anything else. You have a community of people that you want to engage. You have to constantly be thinking about what's going to keep them engaged. You're thinking about the cycle of the week as well, and people have other things going on in their lives, so you want to be cognizant of that. But every other day or so, we run an event in the game. Allows them to participate in a fresh new leaderboard or contest or event that relates to the core functions. You want to think about what actions you want to be reinforcing, and that's what we try to drive activity around. And then that we cycle that along with sales and other things, and that's what just keeps the product engaging, and that's just a core competency that we've had to build up.
And you do that by region as well.
We definitely do think about the regions, in particular with trivia, which is harder to localize because there's a lot of content and there's also a lot of cultural implications. With Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and Jeopardy, we've been fortunate to get all the content from the shows, but we've had to find ways to make it relevant in different places. So we do try to think about that. It does become pretty complex and a lot to manage. So the hard part at the end of the day becomes prioritizing.
Chris, can I ask a question? Yep. Would you call those live ops, would you consider that marketing, or is that a whole other thing?
Live ops is product.
It's product.
Yeah, it's product.
Okay.
So you've worked across a lot of different types of interactive experiences. This is a general question, but what's worked well? What hasn't worked well? Both.
Okay, so what's worked really well is when, for example, let's take The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. We did a fantasy draft with that. So what we did is we leaned really well into what we had seen worked in other markets, what had worked well with the franchise, and then built out from there. And it was very successful. And it did allow for us to have very targeted weekly engagements and reasons for people to come back. And it was a really nice complement to a television series in this case. When it has not worked is when we haven't had enough time being embedded with the company, true fact, no, but and understanding really who we're trying to reach and being in agreement. Where we've had the best experience is when the developer is understanding that they have a great relationship with the platform, and maybe even better is when they have some audience, right, from other things that they've done that we can then build out to.
Right. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I just actually have a follow-up question for you, Deb, around that. From our perspective, I think the medium of interactive just media is starting to kind of merge and blur in interesting ways. I mean, there's defined categories like TV and movies and games, and they've all had their buckets, but the lines are definitely starting to merge a little bit. TV's starting to move into more interactive, yep. Let's say. Games are experimenting with more narrative and things of that nature. How do you see that playing out? How do you get an edge or ahead on that for, when you're advising different game clients and how to think about that?
Well, I really, I'm actually excited about it because, when we first started, it was all transmedia is what we were doing. And then that went away. Social media wasn't a thing. And then now social media is a thing. I was all about the social media. I was like, I don't care about the technology. I care about how do I reach the audience. So it's been a really interesting evolution, and that's a great question. I think what we look at is really understanding who's this audience, what else can we do to keep them growing and engaged, and does it make sense? There was a time when people thought that making web series attached to a television show would be a good idea, and we've all moved on from that. We did try it. Okay, some good laughs in the back. But now what we're really trying to do is really understand when it makes sense to have the game attached to the television show, or to go to the game company and say, you know what, is there something new and bigger that we can do that's going to allow for sustainability, growth, partners, money? Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, no, definitely.
But I'm happy to see it's coming back, honestly, and I do think that we have to always be thinking globally, right? I mean, that's really where we're focused, is thinking globally.
Well, it's interesting. There's actually a handful of examples in the report about studios that thought, like they went after like certain regions, certain targets and audiences, but then they started to use analytics to look at the store platforms to say, hey, like this is actually naturally picking up within Japan, for example. So let's figure out what will make it work even harder and discover and support discoverability even better. Obviously, there's like regionality in terms of language there as well, but there's the opportunity to think locally and then act globally.
Right. I mean, that's for us the reason why we have guesses about where we think that our audience is. Like our insights are insights, but the testing of them is what challenges those constantly. And that's why we do cast a wide net, because we're not willing to accept that we're right all the time. Right. And sometimes that we go down this path where we see something happen in Japan that is totally unexpected. And it's just, we did not anticipate it. And you're right, you do lean into those if they exist. You wish that they happen, because it means that, you know, the person that you thought was going to be the target, there's somebody even more the target. And then you're like, that's a great happy accident to have. And we just try to seek them out. But it's part of, I mean, it's an iterative thing too. Like sometimes if you're on top of it, you can get those lessons earlier than just being like, oh, we built this whole thing thinking it was for this, and now it's turning out for that. That should be happening partway through the project if you're doing it.
Well, it's funny, you know, because it's complex. It's actually really complex, and it does have to be iterative. And, you know, when people finish production on something, they think, okay, well, that's it, we're moving on. And, you know, we've been brought in from, you know, the genesis to then through production to then through launch and then continuing it. And we're just like, we're just starting here, like, because it really does require that reflection back on everything. I love what you're saying, Chris, about how you're able to tie the spends back to the ROIs and then build out from there. I'd love a whole session just on that, frankly.
The next iLunch, maybe.
Quickly, I mean, the thing I think that the systems aren't really in place for there to be live ops in other industries, but there should be. Yes. Because having like a television series with live ops would be brilliant.
But there has been some examples of it, and I've been on like cross-country tours with networks and things. They kill, especially if you go to regions where there isn't a lot happening. The Eden Center is not the place you want to go to do it, in my opinion, but if you go to areas and cities where there aren't a lot of other events happening, or who was talking about going to the Gorilla, right, there we go, going to the Gorilla event, right? That's where you can really, you're talking to the audience, and they're hungry for it.
Excellent. So we only have a few minutes left. Again, this could go on a lot more to get even more insights, and I so appreciate your time and your time again, both of you, to join this panel. Are there any questions for the panel here?
Can I add one more thought?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Can I add one more thought, Suze? Just the other thing you have to remember is there's the organic and the grassroots and the email, et cetera, and then there's always the paid. I just have to put that in there. We have to do
paid is important.
Paid is critical.
Absolutely. Yep. So what, in general, what works on social for gaming? Yeah. And even to take it a step further, is it just like, does it vary by game or by genre?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely varies. There's like with the big games out there, a lot of them are spending like really significant, upwards of kind of 6 or 7 figures a day in advertising on Facebook or on Instagram or whatever. So like that's, when you look at a Candy Crush, they're making a couple $1 million a day, but they're spending a couple $1 million a day as well. And that's just what it takes. So that's the paid portion. I think the organic portion, if you're at that scale, paid sort of trumps the organic portion a bit. But the organic portion, a lot of that happens up front. It happens in how you think about your product, how you've designed things, how you've built into the core product the natural social ness of the product. So does it encourage, does the experience get better if you're playing with your friends? We've seen a lot of that just as game developers ourselves and in the studio. When there's a title out there that's really well designed, it spreads like wildfire and it distracts everybody from doing their jobs. So like it's certainly there, and I think that's actually where you can get a lot of value if you're thoughtful.
One of the lessons I took away from an earlier panel, I think Alex was talking about getting really embedded in a community, and about how if you want to be marketing with someone, you have to also be in their world. And so the gamer communities that exist, yes, they do exist on other platforms. Like you could just list off platforms like Discord or something, but that's just a platform. It's actually a subset of that. It's actually like who are the influencers, who are the tastemakers, and not just saying, okay, well, there's an influencer, I'll buy them. It's like, no, I'm gonna have to find out who they are. I'm gonna have to think of, are we influencers in this space? And so it's not an easy thing to say, like, yes, the traditional model works over here, because what we're seeing, what I'm seeing, and I think Alex spoke to it well, was the idea that every different community is different in the way that they're made up, and you have to be part of it to understand how they communicate.
Yeah, no, I think that's completely true. That's where you find pockets of interesting opportunities, like where nobody else is looking, but you're paying particular attention. That's when you can create a real connection with that community that gives you an advantage over all the other companies that are in the space.
It may even inspire you to form your next game as well, based on what's being uncovered.
100% in the conversations.
Yeah. Oh, Lucy?
What do we need as an industry to become better at discoverability?
It's a big question. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give you my answer. I think that studies like this are helpful. I think forums like this where we exchange how we're doing it, very helpful to hear. Did I take your answer?
Go for it.
No, because we do need to exchange how it's working, because we have to learn from our errors. And congratulations to those who have been successful. And there's a lot of people who want to be successful, but we need to continue that learning and that growth. And it is all also about relationships with we have to build our companies. Like each of these companies who've been successful have a direct relationship with their users and their clients, and that's critical. They also have the relationships with their publishers. So that's also really important.
I'll say exactly what Deb said again. It's as one of the, I still think we're one of the smaller fish, sort of looking up at the bigger pond, and I think the thing I wish we could do is help each other more, and that's like we all are building these relationships, and we're all in our own silos looking at each other as competition, and saying, I'm gonna step on Chris so that I can get my deal or something. But like actually, all of the sort of collective creative power that's going on in this region is something that could amplify each other. And some of the things, like for instance, Ontario Creates is an incredible source of a lot of creative projects, and the Canada Media Fund and all the people who have been supportive of this panel. One of the things that we've come from a model of really independent production, and everybody is sort of an island in that. And I think there could be a way that we could actually pool some resources together in some relationship building.
I also think that thank God for tax credits, because that has given us the additional infrastructure and ability to reinvest in our companies and in development, and that's critical.
Yeah, I mean, so the one thing that I've learned is we started out 10 years ago. We were making mid-core games, I guess strategy kind of role-playing games, and then we switched over and we were making a bunch of other different types of mid-core games, and then we did a bingo game. It's like we were kind of all over the map. We went through a phase in the company where we essentially just stopped doing everything else and did bingo. And through that process, we were able to scale bingo to a top-grossing bingo game in that category. We became experts. We started realizing we actually didn't know that much about bingo. I mean, to be honest, at the time, we were a bunch of predominantly men making a game for a predominantly female audience where we thought we had some understanding or some insight. We very quickly were humbled and realized we didn't know anything. And so just focus is something that I continue to kind of reinforce. And I think for all the different companies out there, there's a lot of people doing a lot of things. It's easy to get distracted and think about what's greener on the other side. So I think if you become an expert at the market that you're focused in on or the types of products that you're building, that will go a long way because we're competing on a global scale these days, right? Yeah.
Great answers. Thank you. So thank you again. Applause for all the panelists.
So thank you, Laura. Thank you, the panelists. And as we said, this is a collective effort. It's the beginning. So thank you to the 27 companies and stakeholders that have contributed to this. A big thank you to our partners, Ontario Creates, the Canada Media Fund, the Bell Fund, Global Affairs Canada, RBC, Ubisoft, and the CMPA. So thank you. And I will say, please go to our website. The study is now live. Share it. If you have ideas about how we can work together to propel us further in discoverability, tell us. Subscribe to our newsletter. There are awesome events coming, a pitch training boot camp, a matchmaking event where we're going to connect publishers, distributors, platforms, investors to the companies here. So stay in touch. Thank you.